Imagine a woman, a mother, who gave her entire life to her family only to be treated like a ghost in her own home. At 75, she discovered a lie so cruel, so dismissive, it shattered a lifetime of silence. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's the story of what happens when the quietest person in the room finally decides to make some noise. What would you do if you found out your entire life was built on a foundation of secrets? Stick with us to uncover the truth. Make sure you follow our channel, like this video and hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss a single second of Elizabeth's incredible journey. The lie was a simple thing, small and neat, delivered with the casual ease of long practice. It was an architecture of deceit built over years, and Jacob was its most proficient craftsman. "Mum, something's come up at the office. A last-minute thing. We'll have to cancel dinner tonight." His voice crackled through the phone, a perfect, studio-recorded imitation of regret. "It's a real shame. I was looking forward to it." Elizabeth sat in the cavernous, minimalist living room, the phone pressed to her ear. The room was a shrine to a life that wasn't hers, all white leather and polished chrome, a space designed to be photographed, not lived in. From her armchair, the piece of furniture so old it was practically an antique protest against the stark modernity surrounding it. She looked out at the churning grey of the Pacific. The Port Blossom oceanfront home was her cage, and its silence was a familiar blanket, heavy and suffocating. "Of course, dear," she murmured, her voice a well-worn path of acquiescence. "Don't work too hard. There's a shepherd's pie in the freezer from last week." "Great. Thanks, Mum. You're a lifesaver." The click was abrupt. He hadn't even waited for her to say goodbye. She placed the receiver back in its cradle. The silence rushed back in, deeper this time. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the sting. She had spent the afternoon preparing, not just the food, a pot roast, his favourite since he was a boy, but herself. She'd put on a touch of lipstick, a silk blouse, a small, foolish effort to be seen. Now, the aroma of slow-cooked beef and rosemary hung in the air, a ghost of a meal that would never happen. She rose, her joints protesting, and moved the pot roast to the refrigerator. A small, sad monument to a cancelled evening. An hour passed, then 2. The house remained still, the only sound the distant roar of the ocean and the hum of the ridiculously oversized refrigerator. Then, a new scent began to snake its way up the grand, floating staircase. It was a smell that was both familiar and utterly forbidden in Amelia's meticulously curated home. It was the greasy, comforting, 12 herbs and spices perfume of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Elizabeth froze. It was their secret. Hers and Jacob's, a silly, childish indulgence from years ago, a treat for when his father Richard was away on business. A bucket of fried chicken and a movie, a small conspiracy against the man's rigid sensibilities. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't felt in years, warred with a deeper, more primal instinct to stay put, to remain invisible. But the scent was a hook, pulling her from her chair. She crept to the mezzanine, her soft-soled slippers making no sound on the polished concrete floor. The railing was cold steel beneath her trembling hands. She peered over. The scene below was bathed in the warm, inviting light of the kitchen. And there they were, her son, Jacob, his face flushed with wine and victory. His wife, Amelia, elegant and sharp-edged, in a dress that probably cost more than Elizabeth's entire wardrobe. And their friends, the Hamiltons, laughing, their voices echoing off the marble island. It wasn't a quiet meal. It was a party. Boisterous, unrestrained joy. In the centre of the island, enthroned on a bed of fancy salads and artisanal bread, sat a massive bucket of KFC. The lie wasn't just that he was at the office. The lie was that her dinner, her effort, her very existence was an inconvenience to be brushed aside for this. For fast food and friends. Jacob raised his wine glass, the crystal catching the light. To finally getting the coastal expansion approved, he toasted, his voice booming with a conqueror's pride. Davenport Holdings is about to own this entire coastline. Clinking glasses, more laughter. Then Amelia, her voice a sleek, cutting thing, added her own toast. And to a future where we can finally make some necessary changes around here. Her eyes, cold and calculating, flicked upward. Directly upward. Past the expensive chandelier, past the minimalist art on the walls, and settled for a fraction of a second on the shadowy space where Elizabeth stood. It wasn't a casual glance. It was an appraisal, the way one might look at a stubborn stain on a carpet or an outdated piece of furniture one was planning to discard. In that instant, the world tilted. The air in Elizabeth's lungs turned to ice. It wasn't about the chicken. It wasn't about the cancelled dinner. It was about the look. It was the culmination of 1,000 tiny cuts, the forgotten birthdays, the conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room, the thinly veiled sighs of impatience when she asked a question, the slow, methodical erosion of her place in this house, in this family. She was not a mother, she was not a grandmother, she was a necessary change, waiting to happen. A single sharp point of pain coalesced in her chest, hot and fierce. The years of quiet dismissals, of practiced invisibility, of swallowing her words until they tasted like ash, it all came together. The final, brittle thread of her patience, stretched thin over decades of silent endurance, did not fray. It snapped. She retreated from the railing, backing away into the shadows of her hallway until her back hit the cool plaster of the wall. She didn't make a sound. She was a ghost, after all. But ghosts can still feel, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Elizabeth felt rage. A cold, clean, liberating rage. She went to her room, the one Amelia's gaze had targeted, and closed the door, the soft click echoing the finality of the snap she'd felt in her soul. The walls of her room were a museum of her own erasure. Opposite the bed, dominating the space, hung the portrait of her late husband, Richard. It was massive, imposing, painted in oils with a self-important gravitas. Richard in his prime, silver-streaked hair, a jaw set with unshakable certainty, and eyes that didn't just look at you, they appraised you. They assessed your worth and, in Elizabeth's case, always found it wanting. To the world, to the Port Blossom community, he was Richard Davenport, titan of industry, charismatic philanthropist, the man who had built an empire from nothing. To Elizabeth, he was the architect of her cage. A beautiful, gilded cage with an ocean view, but a cage nonetheless. The laughter from downstairs faded, but the echoes of the past grew louder. Her mind slipped back, 20 years, 30 years. Pulled by the gravitational force of the portrait on the wall. She was in her late 40s, standing in this very house, though it had felt different then, warmer. She held a cheap certificate in her hands, the paper still crisp. First prize. Port Blossom Annual Art Fair. Her watercolour of the tide pools at sunset had won. She remembered the feeling, a bubble of pure, incandescent joy. She had found a piece of herself she thought long lost, a flicker of the girl who had dreamed of painting in Paris. She'd found Richard in his study, a room panelled in dark wood that always smelled of leather and accomplishment. He was bent over a stack of financial papers, the green glow of the desk lamp illuminating his focused frown. "Richard," she'd said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. "Look." He took the certificate from her, glanced at it for less than a second, and set it down on the edge of his desk, next to a stack of corporate prospectuses. "That's nice, dear," he'd said, his eyes already back on the columns of numbers. He didn't look up. "A lovely little hobby." "They said I have real talent. The judge, he's a curator from the city. He said I should consider having a show." Richard had sighed then, a sound of immense weary patience, as if she were a child who'd just asked a particularly foolish question. He finally looked up, his gaze not unkind but utterly dismissive. It was the look one gives a pet. "Elizabeth, let's not get carried away. An artist's income is unstable, volatile. It's a lovely pastime, but your paintings are for you, for our home. Let's leave the finances, the real world, to me. Your job, your most important job, is to make this house a home, to be the calm centre of my world." He never explicitly forbade her from painting. Richard was too sophisticated for such crude tactics. His methods were far more insidious, a slow-acting poison that paralysed the will. The following week, her expensive set of sable brushes, a gift to herself, went missing. He'd helped her look for them, a performance of concerned sympathy, before suggesting she'd probably just misplaced them. They were never found. When she enrolled in a masterclass in the city, he had, with impeccable timing, scheduled a critical, can't-miss dinner party for his business partners on the same evening. "You're the best hostess I know, darling," he'd said, kissing her cheek. "I can't do it without you." He praised her for the things that served him, her elegance as a hostess, her quiet, supportive presence at his side, the impeccable way she ran the household. He praised her into a box, lavishing affection on the version of her that was silent, compliant, and decorative. Her art, the one thing that was truly hers, became a forgotten, frivolous hobby, then an embarrassing memory, and finally a ghost that no longer even haunted her. He taught her, lesson by subtle lesson, that she was incompetent in the ways of the world. Once she'd tried to balance their checkbook, wanting to feel some connection to their shared life. He'd found her at the dining table, surrounded by receipts, and had gently taken the pen from her hand. "Let me handle this, sweetheart. Your mind is for beautiful things, not this dreary nonsense." The subtext was clear. Your mind is not capable of this. Another time, she'd read an article about a promising tech startup and suggested they invest a small amount. He had actually laughed, a short, sharp, incredulous bark. "Elizabeth, my love, stick to choosing the drapes." Over decades, the poison worked. The constant, gentle invalidation eroded her confidence like the sea eroded the cliffs outside. She began to believe it. She was just Elizabeth, the wife, the mother, the hostess, a beautiful piece of decor in the magnificent house he had built. She was nothing without him. His control was absolute because he had convinced her to build the bars of her own cage, to lock the door from the inside, and to believe the world outside was too frightening and complex for her to navigate alone. Now, staring at his portrait, she saw it all with a horrifying new clarity. Jacob was not a departure from his father. He was his father's echo. The same casual dismissal, the same belief that she was an accessory to his life, not a person living her own. Amelia's glance wasn't just an insult, it was the next phase of Richard's plan, carried out by his proxies. The rage inside her didn't cool, it solidified. It became a lens, focusing the scattered, blurry memories of her life into a sharp, undeniable image of her own subjugation. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The house finally fell silent downstairs. As the Hamiltons left and Jacob and Amelia retired to their master suite on the opposite side of the house. But for Elizabeth the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the buzzing energy of this new, unfamiliar fury. She wouldn't just lie there and wait for them to decide when to put her out with the rest of the old furniture. Fueled by a cold purpose, she began to search. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, a weapon, a deed, a forgotten letter, anything. Anything that felt like hers. A piece of her own history that Richard hadn't curated or controlled. She pulled out the old hat boxes from the top of her closet, filled with outdated but elegant hats she hadn't worn in 30 years. She ran her fingers over the brittle netting and faded silk, but they felt like relics of the woman Richard wanted her to be. She moved to a chest in the corner, lifting the heavy lid. Inside were photo albums, their leather covers cracked with age. She flipped through the pages, Elizabeth at a charity gala, smiling placidly at Richard's side. Elizabeth on their yacht, holding a champagne flute, her hair perfectly coiffed. Elizabeth in the garden, posing beside a prize-winning rose bush. Every photograph was a performance. She wasn't capturing memories. She was fulfilling a role. Deeper in the chest, she found the sewing kits, stacks of them, boxes of thread, needles, patterns. The feminine ephemera Richard had always encouraged and then promptly ignored. It was women's work, useful for mending a hem or reattaching a button, but fundamentally unimportant. He'd bought her the most expensive sewing machine on the market one Christmas, a grand gesture that was really a statement. This is your domain. Stay in it. She pulled them out, one by one, a bitter taste in her mouth. Her hands, which once held paintbrushes with such promise, had been relegated to needles and thread. She was about to push the last box aside, when her fingers brushed against something hard and uneven at the bottom. It was an old tin biscuit box, rusted at the edges, decorated with a faded painting of English cottages. A thing of no value. A place Richard would never, ever look. Her heart began to beat a little faster. With trembling fingers, she pried open the lid. It was 2 a.m, when the soft click of her bedroom door opening made her jump. She looked up, her eyes wide with a flash of fear. A lifetime of conditioning making her feel like a child caught doing something wrong. It was Leo, her grandson. He stood in the doorway, a lanky 17-year-old, silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He wasn't like his parents. Where they were loud and sharp-edged, Leo was quiet, observant. He had her eyes, she thought, the ones that saw things others missed. He didn't look at the chaos of papers and boxes surrounding her with judgment. He looked at her. "Can't sleep, Grandma?" he asked softly. She just shook her head, unable to speak. He came into the room, closing the door gently behind him. He walked over and sat on the edge of her bed, his gaze taking in the yellowed photo albums and the open sewing kits. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the frantic energy of her search. He was the only one who had ever bothered to look closely enough to see it. "Mum and Dad are real jerks sometimes," he said. Not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact. The words were so unexpected, so direct, that a small, choked laugh escaped Elizabeth's lips. It was the first honest sound she'd made all night. "What are you looking for?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I don't know," she whispered, the words raw. "Something that's mine. Just mine." Leo nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. He looked at the old documents, the sepia-toned photographs, the ephemera of a life lived in the margins. He seemed to understand that this wasn't about nostalgia. This was an excavation. "You know," he said, pulling his tablet from the backpack he always had with him, "a lot of this old stuff, it's online now. The city, the county, they digitize almost everything. Property records, business licenses, wills, deeds. It's all public." He swiped the screen to life, the bright light a stark contrast to the room's dim lamp. He typed a few words into a search bar. The logo for the Port Blossom County Public Records database appeared on the screen. It can be a little clunky, but you can search by name, by old addresses, by company names. If you're looking for something official, something that proves ownership or history, maybe we can find it here. He didn't ask why she was searching at 2 a.m. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply saw her need and offered a tool. He angled the tablet toward her. "Here, let me show you." He showed her how to use the search filters, how to cross-reference names with dates. He explained what a property deed looked like, how to identify a business registration number. He was patient, clear, speaking to her not as a fragile old woman but as a research partner. For decades, the world of finance, of law, of ownership had been a foreign country to her, a land where Richard was the sole citizen, and she was a stateless resident. He had told her it was too complex, too dreary for her beautiful mind. Now, her 17-year-old grandson was handing her the map. He didn't give her answers. He gave her something far more valuable. He gave her a key to a world she'd been locked out of her entire adult life. After about half an hour, he stood up. "I should probably get some sleep before Mum realizes I'm not in my room." He gave her a small conspiratorial smile. "You got this, Grandma?" Elizabeth looked from the glowing screen of the tablet to his kind, serious face. For the first time since she heard the lie crackle over the phone hours ago, the cold rage was joined by something else, a flicker of warmth, a tiny, fragile spark of agency. "Yes, Leo," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in years. "I think I do." He left as quietly as he had come. She was alone again, but the room felt different. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was expectant. The portrait of Richard on the wall seemed less imposing, just a painting of a man who was now dead. The real power, she was beginning to realize, wasn't in his stern gaze or his booming voice. It was in information. It was in the truth. And the truth was waiting for her, hidden in plain sight, behind a blinking cursor in a search bar. She was no longer just a relic, a ghost in her own home. She was a researcher, she was an investigator, and her first case was her own life. The days that followed the disastrous dinner party bled into one another, a smear of grey hours marked only by the rising and setting of a sun she barely registered. The anger that had been a roaring fire in her chest had cooled to a hard, dense knot of purpose. Jacob and Amelia moved through the house with an air of strained politeness, a performance of filial concern that was more insulting than their usual indifference. They would ask if she needed anything, their voices dripping with a cloying sweetness that made her skin crawl, but their eyes were always distant, already mentally measuring her room for new furniture, new uses. They were waiting for her to fade, to become the ghost they already believed her to be. But Elizabeth was not fading. She was digging. The online public records Leo had shown her were a fortress of bewildering code and bureaucratic jargon. She would sit for hours at the small desk in her room, the laptop screen a harsh blue glare in the dim light, clicking through portals for property deeds, business licenses,
and tax assessments. Each search ended in a frustrating dead end, a digital wall that seemed to mock her efforts. The language was alien, a dialect of legalese and acronyms, designed to keep people like her out. She felt like an archaeologist trying to read hieroglyphs without a Rosetta Stone. The house, her house, was listed under a corporate entity, Davenport Holdings, a name that felt as cold and impersonal as Richard himself. Every search for Richard's name, Jacob's name, led back to this single, opaque entity. It was a perfectly constructed maze, and she was lost in its centre. Her search became a secret ritual, conducted in the quiet hours of the afternoon when Jacob was at the office, and Amelia was out with friends, her laughter echoing from the driveway, as she left in a car Elizabeth now suspected wasn't truly hers. Sometimes Leo would text her, simple messages, checking in. "Find anything, Grandma?" She'd reply with a simple, "Still looking," not wanting to admit the depth of her failure, the creeping suspicion that maybe Richard had built his fortress too well. The familiar weight of inadequacy, a garment she had worn for 40 years, threatened to settle back onto her shoulders. One particularly bleak afternoon, defeated by another failed search, she decided to do something tangible, something real. She would clear out the old sewing box that sat in the bottom of her wardrobe. It had been her own mother's, a beautiful mahogany box with a faded satin lining. Richard had always hated it. He'd called it clutter, a relic of a past she needed to forget. He'd once tried to throw it out, but it was one of the few times she had silently, stubbornly resisted, moving it from the living room to her bedroom. A small, unspoken act of defiance. She pulled the heavy box onto her bed, the scent of cedar and old thread rising as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a tangled history, spools of coloured thread, a silver thimble worn smooth with use, packets of needles, and a half-finished piece of embroidery her mother had been working on before she passed. A pattern of violets. Elizabeth ran her fingers over the tiny, perfect stitches, a pang of grief and love tightening her chest. This was from a world before Richard, a world where her hands were meant to create, not just serve. She began to tidy the contents, winding loose threads, sorting buttons into a small glass jar. It was a mindless, soothing task, as she lifted the last of the spools from the bottom of the box
her fingers brushed against something hard and uneven beneath the satin lining. Curiosity piqued. She pressed down. The lining gave way slightly. She worked her fingernails under the edge of the fabric, which was brittle with age, and carefully peeled it back. It was taped to the wooden bottom, almost invisible in the dim light. A small, tarnished brass key. It was flat and utilitarian, not for a door. It looked like a key for a locker or a post office box. Tucked beside it was a folded slip of paper, yellowed and delicate. Her heart began to beat a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She unfolded it with trembling hands. On the paper, in Richard's severe, angular handwriting, were 2 lines. Box 713, Merchants Trust Bank, Downtown Branch. A knot of pure, cold adrenaline tightened in her stomach. Merchants Trust Bank. The name echoed from a distant past. They had closed their downtown branch over a decade ago. Absorbed by one of the larger financial giants. She was sure of it. Richard had never, not once, mentioned a second safe deposit box. They had one, the family box. The one Jacob now controlled. The one filled with insurance papers and her mother's old jewellery. This was something different. This was a secret, and he had hidden it in the one place in the entire world he would never, ever have thought to look. He had hidden a key to his secret life inside the very symbol of the domesticity he had forced upon her, a place he held in such open contempt that it had become invisible to him. The irony was so thick, so bitter, it was almost suffocating. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a sliver of genuine, terrifying hope cut through the gloom. Finding the successor bank was, as it turned out, the easy part. A quick online search by Leo confirmed that Merchants Trust had been acquired by a multinational banking corporation, a monolith of glass and steel, with a branch just a 20-minute drive away. The difficult part was walking through its automatic doors the next morning. The air inside was chilled and smelled of clean money and faint, expensive perfume. Men and women in sharp-tailored suits moved with a brisk, silent purpose, their faces illuminated by the glow of computer screens. Elizabeth, in her best cardigan and sensible shoes, felt like a sparrow that had wandered into an eagle's nest. She clutched her purse, the cold brass key a talisman against her palm. She was directed to a sleek glass office at the back. The branch manager was a man who couldn't have been more than 35, with a crisp white shirt, a perfectly knotted tie, and an air of polished professional sympathy. His nameplate read, Mr. Davis. He smiled a practiced, toothy smile as she sat down. Mrs. Davenport, he began, folding his hands on his polished desk. How can I help you today? Her voice felt thin, reedy. I'm here to access a safe deposit box, number 713. It was originally with Merchants Trust Bank. She pushed the yellowed slip of paper and the key across the desk. Mr. Davis picked up the paper, his smile tightening slightly as he examined it. He typed something into his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He frowned. Yes, I see the record here. The contents of the Merchants Trust Vault were transferred to us in 2014. Box 713 is in our vault.
He looked up at her, his expression shifting from polite service to careful, bureaucratic firmness.
However, Mrs. Davenport, there appears to be a protocol we must follow.
A cold dread began to seep into her bones. A protocol.
Our records show this box was opened by your late husband, Richard Davenport. While your name is indeed listed as an authorized party,
He said, and the word authorized felt like a pat on the head.
after his passing, the executor of the estate, your son, Mr. Jacob Davenport, consolidated the management of all family accounts under his name. For security purposes, to prevent any misunderstandings, will require his co-signature to grant you access.
The name hit her like a physical blow. Jacob, of course. It was always Jacob. After Richard's death, he had moved with unnerving speed, presenting her with stacks of papers to sign. His voice, a low,
Reassuring murmur about making things easier for her, about handling the boring financial details so she wouldn't have to worry. She had signed them, grateful at the time, seeing it as a son's care. Now she saw it for what it was. A systematic, deliberate weaving of a net, ensuring her complete and utter dependence. He had not just inherited his father's house, he had inherited his role as her keeper. She stared at the manager, at his bland, apologetic face. He was just a functionary, a cog in a machine, but in that moment he was the face of her entire life's imprisonment. The walls of the glass office seemed to press in on her. His polite, reasonable tone was a death sentence to her nascent hope. It was a pronouncement as clear as any judge's gavel. You are powerless. You are not trusted. You need a man's permission. But my name is on it, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. It says I am authorized. And we appreciate that, Mrs. Davenport, he said, his voice softening into a tone one might use with a confused child. But the estate's current legal structure, as established by your son, supersedes that original authorization. It's a matter of security, you understand. A protection for the estate, for you. For her. The words were a vile mockery. She felt a wave of dizzying, nauseating despair wash over her. It was the old familiar feeling, the weight that had crushed her for decades, the feeling of running into a wall that was invisible to everyone but her. She saw it all with sickening clarity. She would ask Jacob and he would smile his concerned smile. He would ask why she needed to get into the box. He would say he'd take care of it for her. He would go to the bank alone. Whatever was in that box, she would never see it. The secret would be reburied, deeper this time, under his control. The brief, exhilarating fantasy of discovery, of power, shriveled and died. She could only nod. She couldn't find the breath to argue.
What was the point? He had his rules, Jacob had his power, and she had nothing. She stood up, her legs unsteady. Mr. Davies stood as well, his professional mask of sympathy firmly back in place. I'm very sorry, Mrs. Davenport. Please have your son give me a call, and we can arrange a time for you both to come in, he said, handing the key and the slip of paper back to her. She took them without a word, her fingers feeling numb. She turned and walked out of the office, through the cold, silent lobby, and out the automatic doors into the indifferent sunshine. The weight of defeat was a physical cloak on her shoulders, heavy and suffocating. The world, which had seemed so full of sharp, electric possibility just an hour before, had gone back to being flat and grey. She had almost made it out. But the cage door had just been slammed shut in her face. That evening, the house was thick with a tense silence. Jacob and Amelia were out, attending some charity gala. The emptiness of the grand rooms no longer felt peaceful. It felt mocking. Elizabeth sat in her worn armchair, the brass key cold in her palm, a useless artifact from a failed quest. When she heard Leo's quiet knock on her door, she felt a pang of shame. She didn't want him to see her like this, defeated and small. He came in, carrying his tablet, his young face etched with concern. "Hey, Grandma, how did it go?" She didn't have the energy to pretend. The story spilled out of her in a tired, dejected whisper. The glass office, the polite manager, the wall named Jacob. She watched his expression shift from hopeful curiosity to a tight-lipped anger that mirrored her own. He sat on the edge of her bed, listening intently, his gaze fixed on her face. When she finished, he didn't offer empty reassurances. He just nodded slowly. "So, the manager said you were listed on the account?" Leo asked, his fingers already starting to move across his tablet screen. "Yes." "An authorized party," she said, the term still stinging. "Executor isn't the same as owner, Grandma," he muttered, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He was no longer looking at her, but at the glowing screen. A flurry of windows opened and closed. Financial blogs, legal forums, articles on estate law. The speed with which he navigated the digital world was dizzying. Jacob being the executor gives him power over the estate's assets, sure. But if that box isn't technically part of the estate, if your husband set it up differently, he trailed off, lost in thought. "Let me try something. It's a long shot." He navigated to a web page that looked ancient by internet standards. A simple blue and white interface with a pixelated logo. "This is the archive portal for Merchants Trust's old online banking service," he explained. "Most banks keep them running for years for legal and data retention purposes, but they're not public-facing. You have to know where to look." He looked up at her. "Do you remember Grandpa Richard's login information?" A flicker of memory. Richard, years ago, hunched over a clunky desktop computer in his study, complaining about the newfangled inconvenience of it all. She had brought him a cup of coffee, and he had grumbled the username aloud as he typed it. I think it was his initials and birth year. RJD 1945. Leo typed it in. The screen flashed, ** password incorrect. "Okay, how about security questions? Any idea?" She thought for a moment, her mind sifting through the years. Richard was not a sentimental man. It would be something simple, something factual. Try, "What was your first pet's name?" She whispered, a ghost of a memory surfacing, a scruffy little terrier from his childhood. A story he'd told her only once, long before he had sealed himself away from her. "The answer is Daisy," Leo typed in the name. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered and resolved into a new page, a basic account summary dated over a decade ago. It was him. They were in. Leo let out a low whistle. "Okay, Grandma, we're in." He began to click through the sparse menus, account statements, user profile, contact information. Most of it was empty or outdated. Elizabeth watched, her breath held, not daring to hope too much. It felt like trespassing, like peering into a place she was never meant to see. "Wait a second," Leo said, his voice dropping. He had clicked on a tab at the bottom of the page, a tab labelled simply Contingency Directives. A single file was listed inside. It was a PDF document with a date from 15 years ago. The title was Directive Regarding Safe Deposit Box 713. Leo's finger hovered over the link and he looked at her, his eyes wide. "Ready?" She could only nod, her heart hammering against her ribs. He tapped the screen. The file took a few seconds to load, the blue progress bar crawling across the screen with agonizing slowness. Then it opened. It was a scanned document, a single page, but the text was sharp and clear. It was a formal letter, on Richard's old letterhead,
and it had been stamped and signed by a notary public. Her eyes scanned the words, but it was Leo who read them aloud. His voice steady but filled with a dawning sense of triumph. "In the event of my incapacitation or death," he read, "it is my express and legally binding directive that my wife, Elizabeth Ann Davenport, is to have sole, immediate and undisputed access to the contents of Safe Deposit Box number 713, held at Merchants Trust Bank or any of its successor institutions. This directive is to override any and all subsequent estate management appointments, including that of an executor. The authority granted herein is absolute and requires no secondary consent." Elizabeth stared at the screen. Sole, immediate, undisputed, absolute. The words were like thunder. Richard's own words, from a decade and a half ago. A voice from the grave, cutting through all of Jacob's carefully constructed legal scaffolding. "Grandma," Leo said, his voice soft with awe, "he gave you the key. The real key." He was already tapping at the screen again, composing an email. He attached the PDF. In the To field, he typed Mr. Davies's email address, which he'd found on the bank's website. In the CC field, he typed her email address. The subject line was simple: Authorization for Box 713, Elizabeth Davenport. He hit Send. A small notification popped up. "Your message has been sent." It was done. The entire exchange had taken less than 15 minutes. A decade of Jacob's control. A lifetime of her powerlessness dismantled by a teenager with a tablet and a whispered name. Daisy. The next morning, Elizabeth did not make an appointment. She walked back into the Glass and Steel Bank. She wore the same cardigan, the same sensible shoes, but she walked differently. Her back was straight. Her head was high. She saw Mr. Davies through his glass office wall, and he saw her. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before being replaced by his usual professional mask. He met her at the door to his office, ready to politely dismiss her again. She didn't wait for him to speak. She simply held up her phone, displaying the email Leo had sent. "I believe you have received my authorization," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was as solid and unyielding as granite. Mr. Davies's professional smile evaporated. He stared at her phone, his eyes flicking from the screen to her face and back again. He was speechless. He knew exactly what that notarized document meant. He knew it was legally ironclad. He had been so certain of his position, of the neat and tidy hierarchy of power, and she had just blown it to pieces with a single email. He swallowed, a slight flush creeping up his neck. He could only nod, a short, jerky motion. "This way, Mrs. Davenport," he said, his voice now stripped of all its condescending sympathy. It was the voice of a man who knew he had been utterly comprehensively outmaneuvered. He turned and led her from his glass office, not towards the exit, but towards the back, towards the heavy, silent steel door of the vault. The walk to the vault was a silent procession of two. Mr. Davies led, his back ramrod straight, his earlier confidence replaced by a flustered, sullen obedience. Elizabeth followed, the sound of her own steady footsteps on the marble floor a quiet declaration of victory. The air grew colder as they descended a short flight of stairs. He stopped before a massive circular door of polished steel, a complex web of gears and locking bolts gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He and another employee inserted keys into twin locks, turned them in unison,
and with a series of deep, satisfying clicks, the great door swung open. The vault was a hushed, sterile sanctuary of secrets. Floor-to-ceiling walls were honeycombed with small, gleaming metal doors, each with a number and a lock. The air was still and dry. Mr. Davies located drawer 713, inserted his own key, then gestured for hers. She slid the tarnished brass key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a smooth turn, the lock disengaged. He pulled out a long, narrow metal box and placed it on a small, private viewing table in an adjacent cubicle. He slid a curtain closed, leaving her in complete privacy. "Take all the time you need, Mrs. Davenport," he murmured, before retreating, his footsteps quick and quiet. The box was cold and surprisingly heavy. For a moment she just stared at it, this metal container that had sat dormant for 15 years, a time capsule of her husband's secrets. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. What was inside? Illicit cash? Forgotten jewellery? Love letters from a mistress? With hands that trembled only slightly, she lifted the lid. There was no glitter of gold, no stacks of currency, no scent of old perfume. The box was filled to the brim with pristine, cream-coloured folders, each one neatly labelled in Richard's severe, precise script. It was filled with paper, legal documents, all stamped, signed and notarized. With a sense of unreality, she lifted the first, thickest folder. The label read, Port Blossom Residence. She opened it. The top document was the deed to the house. Their house. The house she had lived in for 40 years. The house that had become her beautiful prison. She scanned the legal text until her eyes found the section detailing ownership. Her breath caught in her throat. It had been transferred 15 years ago solely into her name, Elizabeth Ann Davenport. Not a trust, not a holding company. Her. She was the legal and absolute owner of the ground beneath her feet. Her hands shaking now, she reached for the next folder. Davenport Holdings Corporate Ownership. Inside were the original incorporation papers. Beneath them, stock certificates representing 100% of the company's shares. Richard had founded the company, but he had signed it all over. To her. Jacob's entire career, his identity as the heir to the Davenport empire. The very company he used to project his power and wealth, it was all hers. He was, in effect, her employee. She worked through the rest of the folders in a daze, stock portfolios in her name worth millions, offshore accounts she never knew existed, detailing assets carefully moved out of the country. And, near the bottom, a folder containing the titles to 3 luxury vehicles. The sleek German sedan Jacob drove to his office, the ostentatious SUV Amelia used for her shopping trips, and a vintage sports car Richard had kept in the garage, a car Jacob now treated as his personal trophy. It was all hers. Every brick of the house, every share of the company, every dollar in the market, every polished piece of chrome in the garage. It was an empire. And it belonged to her. At the very bottom of the box, lying flat, was a single, sealed envelope with her name on it. She slit it open with a fingernail. It was a letter several pages long, in Richard's familiar handwriting. There was no apology, no confession of love. It was a cold, pragmatic explanation of his twisted logic.
Elizabeth. It began. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have somehow stumbled upon my final contingency. I do not expect you to understand the complexities of the world I built, but I require you to respect the structure I have left behind. Over the years, I have seen the greed in the eyes of my business partners. I have seen the reckless ambition in our son. Jacob has my drive, but none of my caution. He would risk the foundations of this family for a single glorious victory, and in doing so, he would lose it all. I could not leave my life's work in his hands, nor could I trust it to the vultures I called my colleagues. So, I chose a different path. I chose you. I have transferred legal ownership of every significant asset to your name. The house, the company, the investments, all of it. You, my dear, are my ultimate failsafe, my silent vault. I have done this with the complete and certain knowledge that you would never find it. You have no interest in finance, no grasp of corporate law, no curiosity beyond the walls of your home. You are timid, you are compliant, and you are, in this single matter, the most trustworthy person I know, because you lack the sophistication to betray me. The empire is safe because it is in the hands of someone who doesn't even know she holds it. Do nothing. Touch nothing. Allow Jacob to run the company, to live in the house. Allow things to continue as they always have. Your ignorance is the final, perfect lock on the vault. This is my last and greatest act of control, ensuring that what I built will endure. Protected from the foolishness of others by your quiet, unassuming existence. Richard. Elizabeth let the letter fall from her fingers. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it, the profound, calculated cruelty. He hadn't seen her as a wife or even a person. He had seen her as an object, a storage unit, a silent vault. He was so utterly convinced of her weakness, of the persona he himself had so painstakingly crafted for her, that he had handed her a nuclear weapon, believing she was a child who would mistake it for a toy. A slow, cold smile spread across her face. It was not a happy smile. It was a smile of terrible, newfound clarity. She looked down at the documents spread before her, at the proof of ownership, at the keys to her kingdom. Richard's ultimate act of control, his final monument to his own paranoia and ego, had just become her ultimate weapon of liberation. The cage was not a cage. It was an armory, and she was finally ready to go to war. The drive from the bank was a blur. Elizabeth didn't go home. She couldn't. The house was no longer a sanctuary, not even a familiar prison. It was a stage, and she wasn't yet ready for her entrance. She found a small, quiet cafe, the kind with mismatched chairs and the comforting smell of burnt coffee and cinnamon. She ordered a black tea she didn't touch and set her heavy bag on the chair beside her, a silent, leather-bound guard. Using the cafe's spotty Wi-Fi, she opened the tablet Leo had taught her to use. Her fingers, once hesitant on the cool glass, now moved with a new purpose. She didn't type lawyer. She typed elder financial abuse attorney. She typed how to protect assets from family. The search results were a grim landscape of fear and legalese. But one name stood out: Sarah Chen. The website was simple, professional. No smiling stock photos of happy families, just a direct, unflinching photo of a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through the screen, and a bio that was a string of victories in cases just like this. Cases where the wolves weren't strangers at the door, but children at the dinner table. Elizabeth called the number,
Sarah Chen's office was on the 17th floor of a glass tower that reflected the bruised purple of the evening sky. It was sparse, modern, and intimidatingly clean. Sarah herself was exactly as she appeared online, sharp, focused, a coiled spring of energy in a tailored grey suit. She didn't offer platitudes or comforting murmurs. She offered Elizabeth a bottle of water, gestured to a chair and said, "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." Elizabeth spoke. She told Sarah about Richard, about the slow, methodical construction of her cage. She told her about the painting, the silence, the carefully cultivated belief in her own incompetence. She told her about the cancelled dinner, the cruel laughter from downstairs, Amelia's glance at her room as if measuring it for demolition. And then she slid the tablet across the polished mahogany desk. On the screen were the pristine scanned images of every document from Safe Deposit Box 713. Sarah Chen was silent for a long time. She scrolled, her finger moving with practiced speed. She zoomed in on signatures, on notary seals, on the dense, unforgiving language of trusts and deeds and certificates of ownership. The only sound in the room was the soft click of her mouse as she cross-referenced dates and corporate filings on her own computer. Her expression, already serious, hardened into something like cold fury. Finally, she leaned back, looking at Elizabeth not as a victim, but as something else entirely. "Mrs. Davenport," she began, her voice low and steady. "Do you understand what these are?" "Richard's precautions," Elizabeth said, the phrase tasting like ash in her mouth. Sarah shook her head slowly. "No. A precaution is a fire extinguisher. A fail-safe is an emergency brake. This," she gestured to the screen, to the empire of paper, "this is a loaded gun. It's not just loaded, the safety is off, and it has been in your hand this entire time, you just didn't know it." She began to break it down, her words cutting through decades of fog in Elizabeth's mind. The deed to the Port Blossom house. It's not in a trust. It's not joint tenancy. It is in your name, and your name alone, as sole proprietor. He transferred it 15 years ago. Legally, Jacob and Amelia are not your family living with you. They are tenants. Tenants without a lease. She pointed to another file. Davenport Holdings. You don't just have a few shares, Mrs. Davenport. You are the company, the entire damn thing. The commercial properties, the office building Jacob works in, the revenue streams. It's all yours. He made you the sole officer and director in a transfer document that was executed upon his death. According to this, Jacob is merely an employee, a high-level one to be sure, but an employee nonetheless. Sarah's voice was relentless, a clinical dissection of Elizabeth's power. The investment portfolio, the offshore accounts, all of it transferred to a trust of which you are the sole, irrefutable beneficiary and trustee. And the cars. Oh, this is just beautiful. The titles for the Porsche and the Range Rover are in your name. You bought them. Elizabeth felt a wave of vertigo. It was too much, too vast. But why? He told me I couldn't even balance a checkbook. Control, Sarah said, the word hanging in the air like a sentence. It was his ultimate act of control. He didn't trust his partners. He clearly didn't trust his son's ambition or his recklessness. So he moved every significant asset to the one person he believed was too timid, too dependent, too invisible to ever do anything about it. He hid his kingdom in plain sight, guarded by the very person he'd spent a lifetime convincing she was powerless. He didn't give you a safety net, Elizabeth. He made you the vault. The weight of it was crushing, but for the first time it was the weight of power, not of despair. A future, a real one, began to flicker at the edges of her vision. The flicker was extinguished
by a sharp knock on the office door. Sarah's assistant, a young man with wide, nervous eyes, peered in. "Sorry to interrupt, Miss Chen, but there's a courier here. It's for Mrs. Davenport. It's marked urgent legal service." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Bring it in." The courier, a young man in a brightly coloured uniform, looked uncomfortable as he handed a stark white envelope to Elizabeth and asked her to sign a digital pad. The moment he was gone, Sarah took the envelope from Elizabeth's trembling hands. Her manicured nail slit it open with surgical precision. She pulled out the thick, formal document, and her face went blank. "What is it?" Elizabeth whispered. Sarah's eyes, cold and sharp as chips of flint, met hers. "They're moving faster than I thought. They're panicked." She laid the document on the desk between them. The heading was stark and brutal. "Petition for emergency conservatorship." "They're trying to have you legally declared incompetent," Sarah said, her voice devoid of any softness. "Jacob and Amelia have filed a petition with the court. They're citing your recent erratic behaviour, your withdrawal, and your failing mental state. They are asking a judge to grant them immediate, total control over your person and, more importantly, all of your assets. They're trying to put you in a cage of their own making before you even realise you hold the key." The legal filing was a declaration of war, but Amelia's visit was a guerrilla attack on the heart. She didn't call. She simply appeared at Sarah Chen's office the next afternoon, timing her arrival for Elizabeth's scheduled follow-up. She came alone, her face pale, her beautiful eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She'd bypassed the front desk, a spectre of familial grief, gliding through the halls of corporate law. "Elizabeth?" she breathed, her voice a fragile, broken thing. She didn't call her Mum or Elizabeth, just her name, as if it were a prayer. She ignored Sarah completely, her focus a laser beam of sorrow aimed directly at Elizabeth. "What are you doing? We've been so worried." She sank into the chair opposite Elizabeth, not sitting, but collapsing, a portrait of despair. Tears welled and spilled, tracing clean paths down her expertly powdered cheeks. "Jacob is a wreck. He hasn't slept. He came home with that notice from this person." She gestured vaguely at Sarah, as if she were a piece of unpleasant furniture. "He just sat in the dark, holding it. He kept saying, 'What have I done wrong? Why is she doing this to us?'" Amelia reached across the desk, her hand trembling, pleading. "We're family, Elizabeth. We love you. This lawyer, she doesn't understand us. She doesn't know our history. She's putting ideas in your head, twisting things. You know, Richard, you know your husband would have wanted us to stay together, to look after each other. He built that house for all of us." For a moment, a terrible, suffocating moment, Elizabeth wavered. The old guilt, the familiar companion of her entire adult life, rose like bile in her throat. Was she being cruel? Was she tearing her family apart over money? The image of Jacob, her son, sitting alone in the dark, tormented her. The idea of future grandchildren she might never know, of holidays spent in bitter silence, felt like a physical blow. The victory Sarah promised felt lonely. It felt cold. Her hand, of its own accord, began to lift, to reach for Amelia's. And then, a memory, unbidden and sharp as a shard of glass, surfaced from the deep. It wasn't a big memory. It was a quiet Tuesday, perhaps 20 years ago. Richard had just closed a major deal. His friends were over, their booming laughter filling the living room, the air thick with cigar smoke and self-congratulation. Elizabeth, feeling a profound wave of loneliness that had become her shadow, had tried to tell him about it earlier in the day.
She'd used quiet words, speaking of emptiness, of feeling disconnected. He had patted her hand dismissively and told her not to be silly. Later that evening, she overheard him talking to one of his friends in the hall. His friend had asked if she was all right, if she was enjoying the celebration. Richard had let out a low, condescending chuckle, a sound she knew all too well. "Oh, Elizabeth," he'd said, his voice dripping with a kind of affectionate contempt. "She's just being my beautiful, tragic little artist. So wonderfully dramatic. It's best to just let her have her moods." He hadn't seen her pain. He had seen a performance, an amusing, predictable bit of feminine hysteria that required no response beyond tolerant amusement. He had framed her genuine despair as a dramatic flourish. She looked at Amelia. At the carefully crafted tears, the trembling lip, the monologue of a worried daughter-in-law. It was the same script. The same dismissal of her true feelings repackaged as concern. The manipulation was identical, just delivered from a different face, a younger mouth. It wasn't a plea for family unity, it was a performance, designed to manage her, to quiet her, to make her go back to being the beautiful, tragic, and, above all, silent figure in the background. The ice water of that memory washed through her, extinguishing the flicker of guilt. The wavering stopped. Her hand, which had been lifting toward Amelia, slowly, deliberately, lowered back to the arm of her chair. She pulled her other hand, the one Amelia had been trying to grasp, back into her lap. Amelia's performance faltered, a flicker of surprise. Then irritation crossed her face before the mask of sorrow snapped back into place. "Elizabeth, please." Elizabeth looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time saw not a daughter-in-law, but a stranger. A very good actress. Her own voice, when it came, was calm. Steady, it held none of the tremor she'd lived with for years. It was a voice she hadn't heard herself use before. "The meeting is on Friday," Elizabeth said. 7 p.m. at the house. Your lawyer should be there." It wasn't a request, it was a summons. Amelia stared, her mouth slightly open. The tears stopped as if a faucet had been turned off. The grief evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard assessment. She had played her best card, and it had been refused. She stood, smoothing down her dress, the heartbroken daughter-in-law vanishing, replaced by a woman who had just lost a calculated skirmish. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped. "We'll be there." She turned and walked out without a backward glance, the sound of her heels on the polished floor like tiny, angry gunshots. Guided by Sarah, Elizabeth became a director setting a stage.
This wasn't just a dinner, it was theatre, and the set had to be perfect. She sent the invitation not by text or email, but by a formal courier service, the same one that had delivered their petition. The card was thick, cream-coloured stock, the kind Richard used for his most important events. The calligraphy was elegant and firm. "You are cordially invited to dinner on Friday evening at 7 o'clock to discuss our family's future." She spent the day preparing. She chose the menu herself, dishes that were ostentatious and rich, the kind of food Jacob and Amelia loved to post on their Instagram feeds. She polished the heavy silverware, the pieces that were only used for Christmas or when Richard was trying to impress a client. She set the long, imposing dining table with the finest china and crystal, each piece a silent testament to the wealth they believed they controlled. Leo arrived an hour early, as instructed. He was quiet, his teenage awkwardness a perfect camouflage for his purpose. He hugged his grandmother, a genuine warmth that felt like an anchor in the storm she was about to unleash. "Are you sure about this, Grandma?" he asked, his eyes full of concern. "I've never been more sure of anything, my dear," she said, squeezing his hand. "Now, show me again." He pulled out his phone. "It's a private server, encrypted end-to-end," he explained, his voice low.
I'm using a third-party app that masks the stream. No one can access it but me and the link I sent to Miss Chen. They'll just think I'm ignoring them and doing homework, like always. He positioned the phone on a small, unobtrusive stand at his end of the table, angled perfectly to capture the 2 seats opposite Elizabeth. He opened a textbook, put in his earbuds, and became, for all intents and purposes, a typical disconnected teenager, a ghost at the feast. But Elizabeth knew his eyes would miss nothing. Every word, every lie, every flicker of arrogance would be captured, recorded, and saved. At precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. Elizabeth straightened her spine and walked to open it. Jacob and Amelia stood on the porch, flanked by a man with silver hair and a suit that cost more than Elizabeth's car. He radiated a smug, reptilian confidence. They swept past her into the foyer, their expressions a mixture of triumph and impatience. "Mr. Davis," Jacob said, gesturing to the lawyer, "our family counsel." Davies gave Elizabeth a cursory nod, his eyes already scanning the opulent interior, assessing the value of the assets his clients were about to acquire. "Mrs. Davenport, a pleasure. I'm glad to see we can resolve this matter amicably." The word amicably was pronounced as if it meant surrender. They saw the grand dining table, the flickering candlelight, the uncorked bottle of expensive Cabernet. A slow, knowing smile spread across Amelia's face. She shot a look at Jacob that was pure victory. They had her. The old woman had been frightened back into line. This elaborate dinner was a white flag, a final pathetic display before she was shuffled off to a lovely facility. "Mom," Jacob began as they took their seats, his tone thick with the condescending magnanimity of a victor. He poured himself a generous glass of the wine without offering any to her or Leo. "We're so glad you've come to your senses. This whole legal unpleasantness. It's just not you." Amelia chimed in, her voice smooth as cream. "We were just so worried, Elizabeth. Your behaviour has been so unpredictable. We had to act in your best interests." Mr. Davies cleared his throat, pulling a slim leather folder from his briefcase and placing it on the table. "Indeed. And to that end, we have the paperwork all ready to go. Jacob and Amelia have been extraordinarily generous." He spoke directly to Elizabeth, but his tone was for a courtroom, for the record. "They have found a wonderful place for you, the Willows. It's more of a luxury retirement community than a facility. Private suite, garden views, gourmet meals. They will, of course, be covering all expenses. They've also prepared a document that will transfer the management of your, minor assets to Jacob. It simplifies everything. It allows you to relax, to enjoy your golden years without the stress of financial matters you are no longer equipped to handle." Jacob leaned forward, his face a mask of earnest concern. "It's the best thing, Mum, really. We'll visit all the time. You'll be comfortable, you'll be safe. All you have to do is sign." He slid the folder gently across the polished wood toward her. "Let us take care of you now." Elizabeth let the silence hang in the air. She let their words, their lies, their breathtaking arrogance settle over the table like a fine layer of dust. She watched Jacob lean back in his chair, a look of finality on his face. She saw Amelia take a delicate sip of wine, her eyes already redecorating the room. She saw Mr. Davis fold his hands over his briefcase, the deal all but done. Leo, at the far end of the table, was perfectly still, his head bent over his textbook, the camera on his phone a single unblinking eye. She took a slow, deliberate sip of water. The sound of the glass touching the linen placemat was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She looked at her son, at the man he had become, a
a stranger wearing her husband's ambition like an ill-fitting suit. She felt no anger, no sadness, only a vast, cold clarity. She reached down beside her chair and lifted a heavy leather portfolio, the one Sarah Chen had given her. She placed it on the table with a solid, definitive thud. The sound made all three of them look up, their smug expressions faltering for the first time. "Thank you for your generous offer, Jacob," she said. Her voice was not the reedy, hesitant voice of the woman who used to live in this house. It was clear, cold, and resonant with an authority they had never heard before. "It's quite a detailed plan, but I'm afraid I must decline." She smiled, a small, tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "In fact, I have a counter-proposal." From the portfolio, she slid the first document across the table. It slid over the polished surface and stopped directly in front of Jacob's wine glass. It was thick, official, stamped with the county seal. He frowned, picking it up. "What is this?" "That," Elizabeth said, her voice cutting through his confusion, "is the deed to my house, the one you are currently living in. Note the sole proprietor. That would be me." Jacob's face went from confused to slack-jawed. Amelia snatched the paper from his hand, her eyes scanning the legal text, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looking garish. Elizabeth slid another document from the portfolio. This one landed in front of Mr. Davis, whose reptilian calm was beginning to crack. "This," she announced, "is the ownership certificate and articles of incorporation for my company, Davenport Holdings. I believe you'll find my name listed as the sole director and officer. Which makes you an employee, Jacob. My employee." A strangled sound escaped Jacob's throat. Another paper slid across the table, this one directly toward Amelia. It was a vehicle title. "And this is the title to your Porsche, Amelia, which, as you can see, is actually my Porsche, along with the Range Rover. I have the receipts if you'd like to see them." Amelia's face, already pale, turned the colour of ash. Her eyes were fixed on the document as if it were a snake. A final, thick binder landed on the table with a heavy thud, scattering the other documents. "And this," Elizabeth said, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel, "is a comprehensive list of my other assets. The stocks, the bonds, the offshore accounts, the assets which you have been enjoying, which you have been planning to manage on my behalf, and which you've been using to fund this lifestyle." She leaned forward slightly, pinning them all with a gaze of pure forged steel. "So here is my counter-proposal. My dinner is not cancelled, but as of this moment, all of your dinners in my house are. My signature will not be going on your paperwork. I am not moving into a facility." She paused, letting the full weight of her next words land. "You are." The air in the dining room turned to glass, fragile and sharp. For a single, stretched-out second, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, a mundane noise in a moment that was anything but. The smug confidence on Jacob's face didn't just fade, it shattered. It was a slow-motion implosion, the certainty draining away to be replaced by a dark, mottled flush that crawled up his neck. His mouth opened, then closed, a fish gasping for air. "This is insane," he finally managed, the words a low growl. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping a harsh protest against the polished wood floor. He gestured wildly at the documents spread like a funeral shroud on the table. "This is a joke, some kind of sick, senile prank." He turned his glare on Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a venom she had seen before, but never directed so fully at her.
It was Richard's look. "You're confused, Mother. You're not well. We were trying to help you." Elizabeth didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze, her own eyes as calm and deep as the winter sea. "I have never been more clear in my life, Jacob." "Dad would never," he started, his voice rising in pitch, cracking with a lifetime of entitled rage. "He would never leave everything to you, you who couldn't even balance a checkbook. He built this, all of it. It belongs to me. I'm his son." The words hung in the air, a testament to the grand delusion he had lived his entire life. Elizabeth's voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through his rant like a surgeon's scalpel. "Your father," she said, each word precise and cold, "was a paranoid man who built a fortress of assets because he trusted no one, least of all you. He saw your recklessness, he saw your greed. He didn't trust you not to gamble it all away on some foolish whim." She leaned forward slightly, her posture radiating a power he had never seen. "But he made one critical miscalculation. He trusted my silence. He trusted my fear. He believed I was so thoroughly broken that I would live out my days in this house as a ghost, never knowing the power I held. He was wrong." Beside Jacob, Amelia began to unravel. The mask of demure concern and familial duty dissolved, melting away to reveal the raw, terrified greed that lay beneath. A choked, wheezing sound escaped her lips as she stared at the papers, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. "The money," she stammered, her eyes wide with horror. "Our life, Jacob, our friends, the club." Her words were a frantic, disjointed litany of all the things she was about to lose. She wasn't seeing a mother-in-law reclaiming her home. She was seeing her social status, her designer clothes, her catered parties all turning to ash before her very eyes. Her breathing became ragged, shallow. Hyperventilation. It wasn't an act. This was real panic. Their lawyer, Mr. Davies, had gone pale, a waxy, unhealthy colour under the warm lights of the chandelier. He had been shuffling through the copies Elizabeth had provided, his professional scepticism warring with the dawning horror on his face. He adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling slightly. He looked for a flaw, a loophole, a sign of forgery. He checked the notary seals, the dates, the intricate legal language. His shoulders slumped. They were perfect, ironclad. A legal masterpiece of misdirection and control, forged 15 years ago. The predated notarized transfer of the deed on the Port Blossom property is... "It's legally sound," he murmured, more to himself than to his clients. "The trust that holds Davenport Holdings, the sole beneficiary was amended, it's her." He looked up at Elizabeth, not with anger, but with a kind of stunned professional awe. He had been utterly outmanoeuvred. He was a foot soldier who had just stumbled upon a queen. Jacob turned on him, snarling. "Do something. You're my lawyer. Fix it. Claim incompetence. She's old. She doesn't know what she's doing." "On the contrary, Mr. Davenport," Elizabeth said, her voice still unnervingly calm. "Your lawyer can see exactly what I'm doing. I am executing the legal will of my late husband. A will he hid from everyone, including you." From the corner of the room, near the doorway, Leo stood motionless. He hadn't said a word. His phone was held steady in his hand, not overtly filming, but angled just so. The small, dark lens was an unblinking eye, a silent witness, capturing the entire implosion. Jacob and Amelia had been so consumed by their own shock and greed, they hadn't even noticed. But Mr. Davies saw it. He saw the faint red light of the recording. and a new wave of dread washed over him. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was evidence. Elizabeth rose from her chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, the scrape of the wood on the floor the only sound. She was no longer the frail, stooped woman who haunted the upstairs hallway. She stood tall, her spine straight, her presence filling the room. She looked down at her son, not with hatred, but with a profound and chilling finality. "You have 1 week," she stated, her voice resonating with the authority of absolute ownership. "1 week to vacate my property. All of it. This house, the cars, you will leave the keys on the kitchen counter." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Your personal belongings, your clothes, your gaudy furniture, the trinkets you've accumulated with money you did not earn, will be professionally packed and sent to an address of your choosing. You will provide that address to my lawyer, Sarah Chen, by tomorrow morning. If you fail to do so, your things will be put into storage at your expense." Amelia let out a thin, keening wail, burying her face in her hands. "No, please, Elizabeth. Mother, you can't." Elizabeth's eyes didn't even flicker toward her. Her gaze was locked on Jacob. "If you or your wife are not gone by next Friday at noon," she continued, her tone leaving no room for negotiation, "I will have the county sheriff escort you from my home as trespassers. The video evidence of this conversation, which my grandson has so diligently recorded, will be provided to them, along with copies of my ownership documents. I assure you it will not be a pleasant experience." Jacob stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent fury. He was a king who had just discovered his castle was made of sand, and the tide was coming in. All the power he had wielded, all the casual cruelty, was stripped away, leaving only a spoiled, overgrown boy who had been denied his inheritance. Elizabeth took a step back from the table, creating a final, unbridgeable distance between them. She looked at the man who was her son, the man who had her eyes but none of her heart, and delivered the final, devastating blow. "I am not your mother any more," she said, her voice clear and steady. "A mother's love is unconditional, but it is not a suicide pact. You and your father took my life, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left. What you see now is what I have clawed back from the void." She looked him up and down, a landlord assessing a tenant who had wrecked the property. "I am your landlord, and your lease has expired." The seasons turned. The first frost had come and gone, dusting the manicured lawns of Port Blossom with a fine silver coat. The silence in the great house had finally settled. For weeks after they left, it had felt like an absence, a hollow echo in the vast rooms. But now it was a presence. It was the rich, textured silence of peace, broken only by the cry of a distant gull or the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Jacob and Amelia had vanished. There was no dramatic fight, no final tearful confrontation on the lawn. Their humiliation was too absolute for that. One weekday, while Elizabeth was out walking along the cliffside path with Leo, 2 moving trucks had arrived, packed with a grim, silent efficiency. And then they were gone. The petition for guardianship was withdrawn, so quietly it was as if it had never existed. Their social media profiles, once vibrant digital shrines to a life of performative luxury, dinners at exclusive restaurants, yachting trips, charity galas, were deleted. One day they were there, the next just a digital void, a 404 error where a life used to be. The town gossiped, of course. Whispers circulated at the golf club, at the market, over bridge games. The sudden disappearance of the town's golden couple was a mystery too juicy to ignore. But the whispers were a faint, distant hum to Elizabeth. She had spent a lifetime held captive by the fear of what other people thought, a prison built by Richard and reinforced by Jacob. Now, that fear was gone. The only thing she cared about was the warmth of the late autumn sun on her face as she sat on her porch, the salty air filling her lungs. The most significant change was on the wall of the main stairwell. The looming oppressive portrait of Richard Davenport, with his arrogant gaze and proprietary smirk, was gone. In its place hung a large watercolour. It depicted the Oregon coast on a stormy day, the waves crashing against black jagged rocks under a sky of bruised purples and soft greys. The light breaking through the clouds was subtle, but brilliant. Elizabeth had painted it herself just a week ago. Her hands, once deemed too clumsy for anything but needlepoint, now moved with a rediscovered grace. She was an artist again. Leo visited often. He drove up from the city, his old car rumbling up the long driveway. He never mentioned his parents. They both understood, without needing to say it, that that chapter was closed. Instead, he helped her navigate the modern world she was re-entering. He sat with her at the kitchen table, the same table where she had declared her independence, and helped her set up new bank accounts, transfer utilities into her name, and change every single password to the vast digital empire she now controlled. He showed her how to use a tablet to read newspapers from around the world, and how to spot phishing scams. His patience endless. Their conversations were easy, filled with the simple, beautiful stuff of life. They talked about his college applications. He was dreaming of studying marine biology at a university up the coast. They debated the ending of a new series on Netflix, arguing playfully over character motivations. They sat on the wide back porch that overlooked the Pacific, watching through binoculars as a raft of sea otters played in the kelp beds of the cove below, their antics making Elizabeth laugh, a real, unburdened laugh that echoed in the quiet air. One afternoon, as a pale sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and pink, Leo reached over and took her hand. His was warm and strong around her thin, fragile one. "I'm proud of you, Grandma," he said, his voice soft but clear. Elizabeth didn't answer right away. She looked out at the vast, endless ocean, a vista she had seen every day for 50 years, but was only now truly seeing with her own eyes. It wasn't just a view anymore. It was a promise. It was possibility. The world had opened up to her, not because of a man, but because she had finally opened herself up to it. She thought of Jacob. The pain was a dull, distant ache, like a phantom limb. It was the grief for a relationship that had never truly existed, for a son she had loved but never really known. She had lost a son, yes, but in doing so she had won back something infinitely more precious. She had won back herself. She squeezed Leo's hand, a silent thank you that said more than words ever could. Her other hand, holding a warm mug of chamomile tea, was perfectly, beautifully steady. Elizabeth's story is a powerful reminder that the quietest voices can hold the most strength, and that it is never ever too late to rewrite your own ending. We all know someone, perhaps even ourselves, who has had to fight to reclaim their power or find their voice after being silenced. Who in your life embodies that kind of resilience? Share their story or a lesson they taught you in the comments below. Let's celebrate the strength it takes to finally stand up and say, "This is mine."